that's great. And we're still celebrating Easter, that's great. But it's a huge deal to have coffee. And treats. And what an appropriate way to introduce our speaker, Professor Zimmerman from St. Olaf College. She's going to talk on, I think, an interesting topic today, given coffee and treats. How important coffee and treats are to us on Sunday mornings. Hasn't it been just terrible not having coffee? Oh, just not church. Anyway, Trish. Well, you know what? I'm going to let you tell your history, and we'll just welcome Trish to Theology of Food.
It would be mean to talk about theology of food without treats, right? It would be kind of cruel. Yeah. So I'm Trish Zimmerman. I teach up in the religion department at St. Olaf College. I'm a specialist in Christian mysticism. My current projects are on the environment and on mysticism of the prairie, especially. So, but I spent many years in theology of food because I love food and because I like thinking with food and thinking about what it might mean. So I'm going to just take you on, I have more information than we can do, but I'd like to get us to think anthropologically and sociologically about food, and then theologically about food. And I'd like you to think about your own practices with food. I was just telling Ben that I often start my mysticism classes with exercise in mindful eating, where you eat only a raisin and you take about 10 minutes. Has anyone done that? You've done it? All right. It's a little shocker when you first do it, but you use your full sensory experience, right? And you touch and you smell and you put in different places in your mouth. You recognize what the outside is, what the inside is. You feel whether you connect to the essence of the grape. So what would it mean to eat, hey, cupcakes mindfully, or anything really, to connect to the full, where it came from. We're going to run through some scriptural resources in our own tradition, the Christian tradition. We'll spend quite a bit of time there. But for the most part, we'll just be thinking about how it means to talk about food and ultimate meaning. But let's start with a poem. It's a little small for you, but I'll read because I think poetry belongs everywhere. And this is our poet laureate, Joe Harjo. Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of the earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies' teeth at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It's here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor, falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together, once again, at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It's a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial there. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we're laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. I imagine many of you have table stories, and I hope you'll go out from here today and share some of those. But for now, let's conjure for a moment. Bring in your favorite family dish, your favorite comfort food, the thing you reach for. And now think about any food-related memory or ritual? How about shout out just to your neighbor quickly? What's a good food-related ritual or memory? And if you have, you get bonus points if it has anything to do with religion. Just talk to each other for 3 minutes. I could let you do that forever, and it would be good cheating, wouldn't it? I hope that carries over onto lunchtime for all of you. Let you come back. Let's talk about why to focus on religion and food at all. It's kind of weird, right? Why food and religion? Here's the little academic egghead part, and then we'll get into some of the resources. I want to know how food means. That is, how it affects us in a way. And I use anthropologists and sociologists for this. You could use a lot of different things. Religious studies scholars, not just theologians, but people who study the broad things of religion, really like to use everything at our disposal to understand this like wild world that we have called religion. So what are some of the things food do? You might have been able to come up with some of these. We mark boundaries, right? I eat with them, I don't eat with them. That guy, Jesus, had a few things to say about that, right? Sometimes we demarcate where people who are set apart. If some of you have made dietary choices and said, I'm going to eat only from fruits and grains, I'm not going to eat from animals. You have demarcated a boundary with that, and it's linked to core principles, most likely. There's a whole bunch of studies about cooked and raw. When is the raw seen as obscene? When is it seen as spiritual? So you can imagine, think a little bit about like how you feel about cooked food versus raw food. I already talked about the vegetarian meat or meal. Prohibitions to maintain order. Sometimes we structure a whole society over which things we eat. Is our meat halal? Is our meat killed in a particular way? Does our community eat it in a certain way? Can you have rare meat? Can the life force or the blood of meat be in it if you eat it? Because that too is linked to ultimate concerns. Time, are there seasonal things? Do you only eat in season because it might link to local? Do you only eat in season because it links to a ritual calendar? I know at our house we eat seasonally. The first snowflake every year, pula. We make cardamom bread, right? You might have other things that you make only at the Christmas season, which is of course the nativity season for Christians. So think through those things. We mark sometimes sacred food from profane. There's bread. If it's here, or if it's on the table, the altar up there, is it different? That's what we think about, right? To mark sacred and profane. Do you need to perform ablutions or rituals? Does oil make a difference? You can hear how we demarcate categories. You're like, I actually knew already that we did all those things, right? How does food mean? Well, we recognize the source of the food. Is the source of the food the farmer? Is the source of the food the company? The seed? The life force? Can you hear how you'd make a different claim about the food if you focused on each one of those things? And often we have specific ritual activity to prepare and eat. If I say Friday prayers as a Jew over my challah, over my bread, and I light my candle, I connect to my ancestry. You might do it too, maybe over lefse. Maybe over different kinds of familial foods that might have popped up in that first conversation. Think about how you're linking ancestral stories, ultimate meaning, and food. I did a whole mysticism of food project because I'm specialist in mysticism. I love that people claim ultimate connections with God. And I compare Jews, Christians, and Muslims on their food use. Often food is seen as a way to mark them as separate people. I set myself apart by not eating pork products, say, or something like that. But I concentrated on what it brought together, because in all traditions, they claim that feasting and fasting and the types of food that you make can bring you in direct connection to the presence of God. And I find that fascinating. And if we look in the world, just on Twitter this morning, I saw a Christian pastor saying, we welcomed Muslims into our community to break their fast during Ramadan. And what do you know, the guy across from me was someone I had met when I was a soldier. And we reconnected over this food here, breaking the fast. And it was an ecumenical moment, right? It was an interreligious moment. And it was a moment brought there by food. So I'm just throwing a bunch of images because I like to learn visually. Just be thinking about whether you think food unites or divides. Probably, like most students, you're like, both, right? I don't want to commit to either one. It probably does do both, right? These are different snapshots of sacred moments of food from around different religious traditions. And fraught or like freighted in all these traditions are questions of justice, questions of who has equitable access, those kinds of things. Here's another kind of intro. I don't know if you can see the very bizarre still from a film. For those of you who can't quite make it out, it's a very fancy dinner party, and the chairs are toilets. That feels like a disjuncture, right? That does not feel right. So you assume something about food, and it does not involve toilets, right? This is a famous anthropologist who made a film who wanted to tie together issues in bourgeois society, so kind of middle class society, saying that too often the middle class separates from its bodily functions, its appetites, and its waste. You knew something was off with that, and that's because you presume something about the appropriate nature of food. You also know class in food. You know the McDonald's lunch counter from the very high-end akavit, from the potluck at church, from the soup kitchen. You know that a concept of class or economic worth is built into those. And sometimes we attune to them without even knowing, but if we take our religious commitments seriously, we pay attention to class as it functions in food. There are cultural differences. Table manners are very different around the world. Which hand do you eat with? Do you have a communal pot? Or do you have separate individual things? When forks first came into the Western world, they were seen as barbaric because they were weapons, right? So get you thinking about, what do I presume about how we eat, what manners we use to eat? And I just put up the who eats bugs graphic because that often comes up. What we eat is also, I have a friend who's an anthropologist at Carleton College, and every time you go to her house, you have to raid the freezer because it's full of bugs. And she serves you bugs in all different kinds. And I see some faces going, I grew out of that in second grade, right? But there's really interesting research going on about, especially crickets, as a high protein source that's a low environmental impact. And they're making things like, have you ever had a power bar or a Cliff Bar? They're making bars like that out of crickets. And it's having a huge environmental impact. It's also getting food to places that don't have food sources in famine really quickly and without rot. Suddenly, it's not like you, it's like, oh, right? So we do import meanings into different kinds of food and how we eat them. There's also a lot of gender prescriptions rolled into food. And if you are the main provisioner in your household, you go, amen to this, right? In many societies, it's gender divided by the woman who's in charge of the provisioning, not just the preparing, right? The provisioning. Where is that? Do we have any? I'll leave that there. Preparing, what types, at what kind? Does somebody have a big meet? Do they have a big like sports event? Do they need to have a kind of power? Is it pre-marathon day? You need to make sure you have some carbs there. What is it that's needed there? And are there different kinds? The anthropologist who brought us the toilet seat also talked about grilling as a masculine characteristic in Western society especially, and what that means to have it be grilling associated with males. Not always, obviously, but sometimes. And then the cleaning up after. Do you have a maid doing this? That is help. Is there help from your same racial class as you are? Are you juggling everything else? In same-sex marriages, are there gender divisions? We read a fascinating article on this when I taught theology of food. And then you just got to put a requisite old-school advertisement that's fully misogynist and sexist, just to remind us that's not very long ago, right? And you could find a version of it, I think, in vogue today. So how does food mean spiritually? You've heard that phrase, you are what you eat. So you might think, you are what you eat, and that's how you relate to God. Let's kind of think within that. There's a great series of food, farming, and faith that's been going on for about at least a century in this country with Christian theologians, that somehow craving for God and craving for just food sources are related. And the Back to the Land movements and the community gardens, and we just drove by your food truck out there. That is absolutely a part of food and faith, right? And I put a few from the Upanishads and some of the chakras just so you recognize that it's not at all limited to Christian sources, of course. Many religious traditions are adamantly vegetarian for religious reasons. And I'll just let you just look and absorb for just a second a few of the different moments of ritual activity around food. Often divine offerings. In many Christian churches, there's a separate space for the sacrament, if it's been consecrated, where the bread goes in and the wine goes in, has a similar function as some of these prada and some of the divine offerings. Celebrate the Buddha's enlightenment. We just had Passover for the Jews. Particular foods associated with each part of Moses' journey and the people's journey into the wilderness, into freedom. Food connected to freedom and religious liberation. Now it's feeling even more important. Enjoy that cupcake. It's Eastern Orthodox Easter today. They often have dyed red eggs in their bread. I put a mass. I put a great Holden communion. Oh, yeah. Holden is of the land. I could do this forever, right? Shinto shrines, the Sikh Langar. If you've ever been to a Sikh Gurdwara, which is there, we call them Sikhs, but they self-identify. Sikh is how you pronounce it. And we have one up on Highway 35 in Bloomington, and you are welcome there at any time. I take my classes there. And they offer a langar, which is a meal for all. And in fact, all around the world, especially in times of crises, the Sikhs open up their gurdwaras and welcome everyone to sit together on the floor. I say at table symbolically because they sit at the floor, and everyone's welcome. They feed hundreds of thousands of people every day, and it's deeply committed to their notion of theological unity, that everyone, all people are joined with the divine life force, and this works its way out through lentils. All right, so what are some of the key issues in Judaism and Christianity, both historically and today? This is my Bible geek out moment. You could probably come up with some of these, but can you give me a shout out to just a few of the things you think of? I kind of gave you a cheat sheet, but whatever, there's more. Can you think of moments in your scripture where food is an issue? Yeah, the Garden of Eden. So technically an apple. I always love to say that because I'm voting pomegranate. I don't know. It could be anything. Yeah. Yeah, so what does it mean that the foundational story of where we're expelled from the presence of God involves a tree and fruit. Okay? Where else might you run into one? The Last Supper, this famous meal, whether it happened at the Feast of Unleavened Bread or not, is different in the different Gospels. So, like when it happened and if that matters, if it doesn't matter if it's Passover. Christians like to call it Passover because we're switching who the lamb is. It's no longer lamb, it's Jesus. So there's central, food is exactly what matters there. Okay? What else?
Well, the church in Acts, where they tried to figure out if they were going to not only be circumcised, but if they're going to allow for different dietary things.
Yeah, so for everyone to hear, the church in Acts, right? If you remember those first followers of the way, as they called themselves, they were like, do you have to follow Jewish law in order to be a part of this community? One group was like, of course, that's the covenant with God, right? God doesn't change God's mind about such things. And another group was like, no, there's another way to participate in that covenant that's symbolic and not of the food stuff itself. So when they're arguing in Acts about it, the circumcision faction, as they call them, has one answer, and the others, and a great big sheet comes down. And on that sheet, does anybody remember?
All the unclean food.
All the foods. The food you can eat, the food you can't eat, and Peter, it's always Peter, right? Peter is like, I won't eat that. You told me what to eat. I know better. And he's centered in Jerusalem, so he does keep according to ritual law. And God keeps saying, eat, eat, and Peter's like a little rock like that too. And eventually that community decides, right? Eventually, Christians don't keep kashrut, most. There are some groups that do. But for the vast majority, they don't keep the kosher laws, right? Because there was a decision that there's another way outside of food to mark that covenantal boundary. Let's just do a couple more.
I was properly struck, by the Cain and Abel Genesis reference, and it reminds me that food can become a source of death, in the sense of conflict.
Absolutely.
And, and especially if you get the idea that God's blessing they're offering and not.
Yeah, everybody remember that Cain Abel smackdown. This is before the real smackdown. This is when they each offer, the brothers, each offer a sacrifice. One's of fruit and grain, and one's of meat. And God's like, I pick meat. We get no explanation. There's nothing there. Like, you can look at all the little footnotes and try to romp your way around. Believe me, I've tried. There's really not an explanation. But murder results. And there's actually, most biblical scholars believe that the food prohibitions about blood also relate. That one way we maintain our tendency towards violence is in offering back lifeblood always to the God. And so you do that also in your burger, right? How about, I listed a couple other here. I have another screen of them with New Testament. So Noah, we'll go through that, what happens, what changes there. Exodus, my favorite story, because the Israelites are so whiny. The cucumbers were great back there when we were, in bondage, right? If we could only have meat, they say, and those cucumbers and the melons, and Moses is like, friends, do you hear yourself, right? And then has to go to God and say, and God makes a system there that we'll look at. The gleaning, right? You have a mandate to leave some of the food in your field so that those who don't have a field can come eat. Because does that field ultimately belong to you? To God, right? So this is the food truck of the ancient world, right? It's parked in the edge of their field. And I once lived in a parsonage where they had a God's acre, where that acreage went to the pastor as part of that give back. Very interesting. Passover, fundamental story from slavery to freedom. They get to use both symbolically and literally. And then the Eucharist, as we pointed out, and commensaliity. With whom may you eat? Who prepares your food? What kind of food? All those things are freighted into New Testament stories that it's a big clue to us that eating matters. When do you fast and how do you do it? Most religious traditions have both fasting, that is abstaining from food for particular periods, and they see a spiritual benefit in that, and they have feasting, go all out, and they see a spiritual benefit in that. Can you eat food sacrificed to other gods? Right? What Paul calls idols. So can I go into a place where they've done a food offering, and if you travel broadly, this is not just an ancient issue, it's a question right now. Can I go interreligiously to a ritual that some of my friends may have, where they offer food to the gods? Or my religion says there's only one God, and it's not that one. What do I do about that? Does anybody remember what Paul says in that?
He says, everything is lawful, but not everything is helpful. So
Yeah.
if you cause other people to fall and you're acceptable, don't do it.
Exactly. Everything is lawful, but not, because that sheet came down. But not everything is helpful, right? If you're going to cause your neighbor to stumble, and they're going to think, oh, it's okay to eat other gods' offerings, then don't do it. If everybody in the room is like, that doesn't work, of course that's not God's food, right? And we have different sets of questions with that, I think, in an ecumenical 21st century context than maybe the first century world even had. So there's a place where you'll dialogue with your religious tradition on what to do in interreligious moments and what the theological import of the food is. Okay. Genesis, good place to start. Okay. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. There's our menu, according to the priestly account. There's two creation accounts at the beginning of Genesis. This one's by the priestly source. And what do we get to eat? What's on the menu?
Vegetables.
It's a good one. Seeds, nuts, fructivores, we often call it. Seeds, nuts. That's it. That's what we have. That's our food. I know, I love separating these out. The second one, right, a different source for Genesis. There's a bunch of sources stitched together. The Lord God, here we call God Lord God, two combinations, took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded man, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. Why? I bet you've spent time thinking about that one. But it's clear. You get to have all the trees, all the fruits and veggies you want, just don't touch that one. Something about getting knowledge, whether it's a maturation narrative, right, that you grow up that humanity had to grow up and meet death and birth and hard labor. There's lots of reads to it. But for our purposes, you get to eat the trees. We talked about this one already. After the flood, after like humanity 2.0 for God, the source tells us, and again, it's a priestly source, which is interesting to us. God says to Noah after the flood, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings. What changes after the flood? Burgers, right? Like we get meat now, right? And there will be two whole books of the Torah dedicated, huge chunks of it dedicating how you eat that meat, right? A theological kind of cookbook. And what's the principle here, though? They give us a principle. It's not just eat everything you want, enjoy that steak tartare, What does it say? What does the God tell them in this source? Don't eat it with the blood. Why? Because it's the life source. There's a reckoning around that, just like there was in Cain and Abel. Exodus and Numbers stories. If you haven't visited those for a while, I recommend it. It's a hoot. To listen to the people out there being led. They've escaped slavery, and they're just like one thing after the other that they're pestering Moses about, and a lot of it's food, which makes sense, right? They're leaving, even if it's slavery, they're leaving sure source of food. Although Pharaoh was starving them too, which is not the smartest in your workforce, but whatever. When they get out there, they get this thing, you remember manna, right? But the translation is just called, what's it? That's what manna means, what's it? Like, it rained down. God said, I'm going to give you some stuff. It's going to be delivered, right? And does anybody remember the prohibitions around it? Yeah, don't stockpile it. Don't get greedy with it. You get enough for every day, except before the Sabbath, and you get a double dose. And so, of course, the Israelites behaved, right? Oh, wait. And what happened? Maggots. It got all rotten and it made them sick. Same thing with the quail, because they were like, okay, so I see your what's it, but I really miss the meat. What I'd give for some... God's like, okay, here's some quail, right? Same prohibitions. They get food poisoning, right? Because they are not attending to the life force and the way in which somebody should eat it, right? There's ritual collection rules, and it's about God's superabundance being given out and the lack of gratitude and understanding for that, even among the people being led to freedom. I love Leviticus, and I know I might be not in the majority. How many have tried to read the Bible front to cover and like burned out a moment in Leviticus, right? You know, you're like with the not this and the that, and what's with the hem and the, yeah. But there's some principles at work that are really beautiful, especially in the food sections. Don't mix a kid with its mother's blood. With its mother's milk. So no cheeseburgers, right? No meat with cheese. How come? What's milk meant to do from a mammal? Feed the next generation. What are you doing when you eat them together? You're not recognizing how you're supposed to feed the generations. So it might feel arbitrary to us. There's a very famous anthropologist named Mary Douglas who goes through these food restrictions in Leviticus that shows how it's very ordered. It feels arbitrary to us if we didn't grow up in kosher households. Keep meat and dairy separate. But when you hear, oh my goodness, that was about recognizing where life comes from, it becomes a different story, right? There are many other ones. How come not shrimp? Well, shrimp are swimming in the ocean, but they don't swim, they crawl along the floor, so there's something wrong in that system. It's disordered. That's one way of making it ordered. Now there's a bunch of materialist readings. There's a bunch of people who say, well, the reason they did this is because pork can actually make you sick if it's undercooked, and that's the reason. That isn't actually the ritual reason. The ritual reason is they're a different kind of hoof going with a different kind of eating, and they're trying to make a strict order because God's universe is ordered. Right? So you can go back and sneak around in there, right, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and see if you discern some principles. And if you have good Jewish friends, ask them how they see that working out. Like any religious group, they're going to be like, yeah, some days I think about it, some days I just do what I'm told, right? But there's a principle behind most of them, and they're theological. In the New Testament, we have a lot of conversation about this. The ritual meals are often associated with miraculous feeding. They only have a little bit of fish, a little bit of bread, and suddenly they can feed everyone. And Jesus in the Gospel of John, remember that manna, that bread of life? Jesus says in the Gospel of John, where all his I am statements are, I am, right? And that he says, I am that bread. So we've moved from the bread in the wilderness, the ritual use of that by the time we're in first century Palestine, and now put on the charismatic leader, saying something about this leader is the bread of life and how that might work. For some, that means there's a ritual sacrifice, just like there was in the temple. So it's a sacrificial atonement. For others, it's a restorative, food-based, bringing into energy and life. There are different takes on what it means for Jesus to be the bread of life. For some, it's set in Passover. It's not in John. There's a prohibition from Paul, who's always trying to get, I don't know, we laughed about Peter because he's always in trouble. And Paul's always running around screaming about, like, unity, unity, unity. You don't have to scream unity, unity, unity if everybody's united, right? So he's saying, what are some of the issues that divide groups? One of them's eating, right? He's like, don't divide about who gets to eat and who sits, because they go to they're outside of Jerusalem, the central, right? When they're outside of central, they're eating with all kinds of people. In central, they're still keeping to their kosher laws. But out there among the diaspora or the Gentiles, they're inviting everybody over, right? And there's a fight within the early Christian community. Often Christians like to say today, oh, that was a fight of Jews versus Christians. And then a lot of anti-Judaism gets pushed into that and massaged in. This is an inner first followers fight, some of whom are Torah loyal and stay within their group, and some of whom have never been introduced to Torah. And that's the decision to make. Do you need to enter through food laws, through all these other ways of ritual prescription that God promised meant a covenant with you or not? So it's not a Jew versus Christian. They're not calling themselves Christians yet. They're not seeing themselves as a separate group yet. This is an inner family fight, and if you've ever sat at a dinner table with an inner family fight, how'd that go for you? That's what we read. And if we forget we read that, we push a lot of problems onto the text. So always think of that, ooh, I'm at Cousin Paul's dinner, and he invited that side of the family, right? What does this mean? That's how you read Corinthians. This is one of my favorite gospel stories. We end at 10:30, is that right? 10:20? 10:20, okay. The Syrophoenician woman, this story shows up in all the gospels. Do you remember this woman? Syrophoenician just marks her as not a Jew. And she goes up to Jesus and she says, help me. And this is what Jesus says to her. I hope this sounds shocking. Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. The dogs, as in you, female person, pulling on me. I'll let you do the math on the language there. This is not the Jesus most of us recognize. This is nasty, right? But she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. There's a little exchange. He's like, I don't feed dogs, lady, like you. I'm here for the in crowd, right? She says, okay, I'm not going to tell you I'm not a dog, but I'm going to say even the dogs get to grab up the crumbs. And his response, for saying that, you're made well. As in, you got the logic of the Torah. You were right. Right? And then what happens? Miracle feeding in the Gentile, the non-Jewish situation. So there are these moments that name, if we're listening, they name the tension for us. That this was a tension in the ancient world about marking boundaries of the in-group through food. That's the sheet, we can't do that. That you already covered, that there's a principle, food will not bring us close to God, which I think he's wrong about. Paul and I have our issues. Food practices in light of biblical issues. What issues do you think show up today with food? If those were the ancient world issues, what kinds of things do you all struggle with here What kinds of food issues come up in everyday life for Christians today? Let's hear a couple.
I think about questions of how often you practice the Eucharist.
Yeah, how often to practice the Eucharist, right? Is frequency a question? Does it diminish? Does it add? And who all gets to be there? Did you need to take a class first? Or does a baby get to stick out its tongue? Right? Good. And who provides it? Does it need a specially ordained person to provide it? Or is it a kind of love feast that everybody just passes around? Those are all division markers within Christian denominations. So all those divisions from Paul's first century, I'm just going to say we got even more, right? We got a lot. And how the Methodist eats, how the Roman Catholic eats, how the Eastern Orthodox eats, they're different, right? And whether that marks a distinction or whether the primary thing is it brings you together because you all eat, that's one of the questions. What's another one that's out there now being thought about, like food and religion? Where does it come up in your church, in your life?
Well, there is the feeding of the hungry.
Feeding on the hungry. Jesus was pretty clear. He said, if you love me, feed my sheep. And he was being metaphorical, although probably also literal. Feed the animals too. But yeah, if you really want to demonstrate the love of Christ in the world, feed people. If you haven't read Take This Bread by Sarah Miles, I have a resource page here and I can send it to Enid at the end, but it's a beautiful book set in, I see some people have read it, in California, about a woman who was actually an atheist and a war reporter and stumbled into a church, took communion, changed her life. And she runs a series of food pantries in the hardest hit areas in California now, and started a wave across the country with it. A wave that extends, of course, to her parking lot. Let's just put a couple more issues. Where else might it come?
The idolatry of food.
The idolatry of food.
Whole foods market.
And what makes those ones idols in ways that Cub isn't?
That it's the food that is going to save us.
Oh, good. Okay. Can food save us, sourced properly or done right, or
It's for the righteous eat the right food.
the righteous, which is also in both those examples built into class? Yeah. Yeah. So I was thinking you meant overconsumption when you said idolatry, because also overconsumption if we have what percentage of the world's population and what percentage of the world's resources. There's enough food for everyone. So why isn't everybody eating? So that idolatry as well.
Is there an issue, I know you're talking about, but is there an issue in the Bible about gluttony?
Absolutely, gluttony or hoarding, say. It's amazing that like all of our Applebee's don't turn into maggots, right? If we're gonna extend the manna story. Right? So that question of, we had a prohibition given by our God to not hoard food. What would it mean? Yeah, those are all great issues. And I think mindful eating principles too. Sometimes mindfulness gets a bad rap because it's kind of crystals and who knows what. But when you really consider, and I hope you will, how might your eating mark your connection to your God? You can come up with a lot of things, right? So try that at the next feast. And the beauty of familial gatherings, where generations come together over a type of shared food, it's not just criticism that's in there, it's beauty, right? And communion that's built into it. And you already have all named a lot of issues of food justice. So go back to that family food dish, or that comfort food, and that food-related religious memory or ritual. And maybe add some of these ideas behind it and ask how they might play out in the way that you have a memory of that and the way you might do it the next time you mark your food ritual. These are a whole bunch of resources which I'll send to Enid and she can forward on. Oh, and she has the whole PowerPoint, so you can look at all of it. Thank you for your kind attention. This was lovely.
Most of you came down from church, but what questions do you have or comments for Trish? If you want to just say it, I'll repeat it for the microphone.
Yeah. Get that.
That presentation?
Yeah, or the list of
The list,
resources.
I will send it to you.
Ask and ye shall receive.
If you, let's see if we can find a piece of paper. A piece of paper in that pen?
Yeah, probably.
And I have a pen, and you can write your email down. Anybody that wants that page, is that what you need? That page, okay.
I lied, I have a Bible.
All right, have we got a napkin? Have we got a service bulletin that you're done with? Thank you.
What kinds of issues do college students raise around this?
Oh, I love that question. What kinds of issues do college students raise? College students are very dialed into food as a marker of community and ultimate meaning. Many of them work in local food sources. So they'll work, and I'd say in Olaf, we have a farm, and they work at Stoke Road, and they see it as intimately connected. I have a student right now in a comparative mysticism class who about every third day talks about why veganism is so central to him and why being a vegan marks his relationship with his deep spirituality. They definitely see it as very connected. They are just starting to analyze their home structures to see if there is class and race and gender built into food practices and what that might mean for their ultimate understanding of a liberating God.
No? You want to, oh, you want to write that down, okay. All right, any other questions? This is where the emails are for that resource list. Anybody here? Okay.
You can find a lot of beautiful books out there if you go on the old Google and look up things like religion and food. You'll get a lot of academic studies, but you'll also find things like this Fred Bonson, who is a Methodist who started a whole garden program and food share program. Or Barbara Kingsolver, I bet some of you have read her works. She decided to live a whole year on local food, except when she picked, what did she say, bananas and coffee? There was two things that she allowed for exceptions, right? And still continues. If you follow her in any of her social media, you know she does most of her own food.
It would be hard to give up coffee. And tea.
Yeah, for sure.
We don't have coffee and tea growing around here. If that's it, for those of you that need to get to church, you probably should. Thank you.
Thank you for
Professor
having me.
Zimmerman, Trish, and